Okay.
Hey, welcome more gamers. This is Doug with 2 Plus Stuff, and today we're starting off our new series called Ways of Change, which is my kind of dive into 40k. This is going to be sort of an ongoing tactical series as I introduce kind of the game to myself, meaning you can learn along with me and go from being a nobody to a better player. This all spawns from a goal to become a more well-rounded hobbyist this coming year. For the longest time, I always kept pushing it off, saying like, oh, I'm not a competitive guy, I don't get rules lawyer, nothing like that, and missed out on the fact that being actually good at the mechanical operations of this game, like being good at playing the game, makes me a well-rounded person. It doesn't shoehorn me into, you know, ITC competitive lists and all that stuff like that. So I'm on a journey as well as AOS and 40k, because I have Tzeentch demons, which work in both, and I thought I would just dive, you know, a cannonball into becoming a better player in both games. With the AOS one, that one's called King of Games, you can go check it out. I'm much more comfortable with those rules in AOS. I'm not nearly a noob in AOS, but with 40k I am, and so this video is really just the #1 benchmark. Starting in the hobby, I have a game that I played that introduced me some new concepts, and if you are also interested in transferring from AOS to 40k, I'm going to have some thoughts about the differences that you don't necessarily see initially, as well as some cool stuff that if you play 40k, things that you don't know you're missing out on with AOS. So let's go ahead and dive into that. To give some kind of background with my history with 40k, it's actually one of the first games that I tried playing when I was much younger. This is back when I lived in Jersey. I was a very, very young child. Got some models from my grandmother. One set was like Bretonnian Knights. I think another were a couple Grey Knights way back in the days. Probably about 4th or 5th edition of 40k. Went down to a local store, and there were just some great guys who, you know, even though I was very young and had no idea what I was doing, they kind of like nursed me along and just included me in stuff, let me, you know, control a single unit in a game, those kinds of things. And left the hobby for a while, came back with War Machine, jumped into 40k again, had some Necrons before their good codex in 7th edition, I want to say, and kind of teetered out, went into fantasy really hard. And so when they announced that 40k was also getting a new edition, and that was very similar to AOS, I was on board. When the new 40k dropped, I had Deathwatch army, just because I enjoyed painting them, and had some Blood Angels. I cycle through armies quite a bit. It's more for painting projects than it is for like collecting, owning, and playing. And so yeah, that's kind of where I was for a while. So at last I had an AdMech army, wasn't really attached to them. And so when I got these demons that I've really loved building and painting for AOS, now that the, not the General's Handbook, but Chapter Approved, that's what it's called, the equivalent for updated yearly rules like that is out, I thought, well, you know, I'll jump back in. I have a great friend named Ben who plays 40k almost exclusively, does a little bit of X-Wing too, and a great group over in the next town over. So I said, hey, you know, if I stop by, would anyone be willing to do a practice game? Ben said, yep. We had a great time. And so that kind of catches you up on where I'm coming from. I'm very, very lightly and loosely familiar with the rules. I played it a little bit with my Deathwatch when they first came out. The problem is Deathwatch were kind of in a weird place when the indexes dropped, rules-wise. And so I didn't get a good sense of the army. And now I'm coming back to it. I know a few things from memory, and I know obviously AOS, which it draws a lot of inspiration from, but the depth of differences kind of caught me by surprise. And so as I'm talking about this game, we're going to kind of cover those. So diving into the game, what I brought, we played roughly 1,000 points. I brought a Lord of Change, a Change Caster, which is a Herald on foot, because they gave it a unique name. His name is Geraldo for being a Herald. I'm sorry, I bumped the mic there. In addition to that, I brought 3 units of 10 pink horrors, enough reserve points for 20 blues and 20 brims, and 2 3-man squads of flamers. In AOS, they're fantastic in 3-man units. 40k, I might just go for a 1-6-man in the future. We'll see how that goes. My opponent Ben has a awesome Salamanders army, and he had a few kind of random lists at 1k, and so he's telling me roll a dice and that'll determine what list I take, which is kind of a fun idea. Based on what I rolled, it was a very elite heavy shooting army. So it was 2 units of Devastators, 1 in a drop pod, 1 in a Rhino. The drop pod was there just because he never gets to play with it usually. A unit of 3 Centurions with like the heavy bolters and the hurricane bolters, just like loaded to the gills with shots. And then a captain and a lieutenant. One gave rerolls of 1 to hit, one was reroll, 1's to wound. And so I'm going to start throwing some pictures up here on the screen so you can kind of follow along with me. Had a fantastic time. We rolled for a random deployment. We basically split the board in half. We're doing a test game, learning experience. And we did that first kind of narrative thing where like you each put out 2 objectives, roll a d3, and then that kind of determines what the mission is. We got the second one down, which is randomly we determine one of those objectives. That's the one you're all fighting for. And so it just so happened the one that we were all fighting for was in the dead center of the table. I was able to get turn 1, and so I ran just about everything forward. I put a 10-man unit of pinks on the objective. At this point, I should note that I did use the stratagem Demonic Incursion to have the Herald and 2 units of 10 pink horrors in the warp, or out in space, whatever like that, for later deployment. So on the board, it was just pinks, 2 units of flamers, and a Lord of Change. From that, he dropped his Centurions on the board. Rhino drove up and dumped out a unit of Devastators with missile launchers and heavy bolters to my forward left. Trying to give you a perspective of the board from mine, because that's where all the pictures will be. And Centurions were on the far right. And then he dropped in the drop pod directly behind me, like dead center of the board, directly behind me, as close as he could get. And a bunch of Devastators with like heavy weapons. I think plasma and melta-guns, I think. I'm not incredibly familiar with those ones. And the captain came out. And they lit me up from behind. They got the Lord of Change, tagged him a little bit. This game, the first 2 rounds, I did exceedingly well on my invuln saves, so that was awesome. If you're not familiar, Tzeentch has a 4-up invuln on almost all its units, with the exception of blues and brimstones. So, oddly durable. We'll get to that in a little bit when I kind of do my recap. First 2 turns, I weather the storm of his firepower. With the next turn, I drop in everyone in reserves, basically, and I have them kind of act as a buffer. They come in right between the drop pod and all its crew and the Lord of Change. Okay, so instead of pushing forward with everything, I had them kind of fill that gap in the back. My thought process was, those guns represent the biggest threat at that time to the Lord of Change. Let's eliminate those. And so pinks came down right there, lit up that team with some firepower, because the Herald gives them +1 strength. Since their weapons are user strength, they do pretty well. Pinks are actually fairly good at shooting. The unit that sat on the objective just kind of shuffled around to make sure every ounce of it was covered and that everyone received the benefits of cover. Lord of Change went over and picked a fight with 2 Centurions. He killed 2 of the 3 Centurions, which is like incredibly cool. And that was basically it. From there, I'm just going to fast forward. It was really a grind fest. After there was 1 Centurion left, Ben backed him out, thinking he could coax the Lord of Change to get further away from the battlefield. Instead, I didn't take his bait and shot him straight over to the other unit that came out of a Rhino, the Devastator squad. Was able to do the Treason of Tzeentch on that lieutenant back there in the corner, had him charge and fight and shoot his own dudes. With that turn, the Lord of Change mopped up and just took out everyone over that corner. Down below, with the drop pod and stuff like that, that unit, the 2 units of pink horrors that I dropped down, only 1 made it into combat. The other one did really nothing the entire game. But the one that made it into combat, I kept doing the splitting rule on them. And the reason was, once the Centurions were cut, bound by 2/3, and that unit to the top left is gone, the only threat to wiping me off of the objective marker is this unit with all the firepower back behind me, so keeping them all engaged. It was the whole plan. Just keep them all tied up from shooting. And so that's exactly what I did. And so every time you would kill a dude, I would throw down 2 blues. For 2 battle shock tests, I think, in the entire game, rolled a 1, which if you have the standard on pink horrors, you get to bring back D6 pink horrors, which is so good. Yeah, and that's really what it was. So it was just a grind fest. I just basically negated the back unit by keeping them tied up and busy. Lord of Change wreaked havoc on everything up above. Meanwhile, nothing in that combat had enough direct firepower to wipe off the unit of pink horrors from the objective, and I won. So in the end, I got the main objective, which was 6 points, Line Breaker and Slay the Warlord. Yeah. Which I think made 8 points, right? Because the main one's 6, and the other 2 were 1 each, so I think it's 8 points, and then Ben got First Blood because he killed a unit of Flamers outright. And so it was a really fun game. Ben's an awesome opponent, very clear. He's a great teacher of games. So it made it very quick and easy. By turn 2, I really had a good idea what was going on. Going into things that I've learned that are very important to speak about if you are also coming from AOS is, first I want to go game-wide, and then I'm going to talk about Tzeentch Demons specifically. So game-wide, there's a huge thing that I think is not given enough appreciation, and that is the fact that in AOS, you start with your hero phase, which is where you do all your magics and stuff like that. In 40k, you do movement and then psychic phase. Why is this important? Well, because in AOS, part of the tactical nuance of Tzeentch Demons is making sure that when you do a movement phase now, you put yourself in a position to do the spells that you want to do in range next turn, right? It's a heavy emphasis on model placement. With this, being able to move and then do stuff made it a lot easier, actually. And so it was kind of jarring my first turn, where it's like, I know Smite can only target the nearest enemy, which is different than Arcane Bolt. But how do I get to where I need to be to do that? But if you move first on a 12-inch or 10-inch movement for a change, he can be wherever you want him to be. That's awesome. That's probably the biggest one. The second one I noticed is that every 40k player in the world should universally write to their congressman or something like that and have GW make War Scroll cards. If you're not familiar in AOS, whenever they release a new battle tome, they put out a little packet, it's about this big, and it's just War Scrolls. It's literally printed versions of what's inside the battle tome. Sorry, I put the mic again. And it makes it very easy when you're playing a game. You just pick out the ones that you're playing, put on the table. They also have stuff for spell lores and things like that. It makes it very easy to organize everything you need to know. And I do have the card pack, like with the stratagems and objectives. There you go, objective pack. But it's different because in the Demons book, it's very confusing if you're new, because you have Khorne LHQs, Tzeentch HQs, Nurgle HQs, and then it goes Elites HQs. You know what I mean? And so like it separates all the different gods by their unit types, rather than this is all the Tzeentch ones, this is all the Nurgle ones, this is all the Slaanesh ones. And it gets very, very bogged down of me flipping pages for that. If I had them printed out and separate, I would pay money for that. I've already done it in AOS. It's fantastic. So you should want that. What else? So those are system-wide things. As far as Tzeentch Demons go, this was a huge learning experience, because Tzeentch Demons are extremely different in 40k than they are in AOS. In AOS, my strategy revolves around throwing as many bodies at the opponent as I can to keep them at bay, while I barf out mortal wounds with the Lord of Change and a Gaunt Summoner, like a wizard, if you're a 40k player and don't know what I'm talking about. Just a high-powered wizard. And so, in this, though, I noticed that the units have a lot more, first of all, quality shooting. Just the addition of strength versus toughness, and the fact that I can buff up pink horrors, it's great. And so, you know what I mean? Like the shooting meant more in this game than they did in AOS. Kind of tailing off that, in 40k, Blue and Brimstone horrors do not have guns, but they do in AOS. I found that the effectiveness of those two units went way down. They were hot garbage in 40k. They exist to do nothing more than to soak up wounds. Whereas in AOS, if I have enough of them, they'll still do work, which is interesting. Moving on to beyond like spellcasters, that I found that the lore for Tzeentch Demons, like the actual the list of spells, spell lore, I guess I'm going to say, is not as interesting as I feel like it is in AOS. By that I mean, in AOS, there's cool stuff like the treachery spell doesn't target a leader, it targets anyone in a unit. So if I could target that unit of Centurions, one Centurion would fight the other two, which would be so cool. But that same spell in 40k is you target a leader, you have to roll an 8 to get it, and then you have to roll something, 2 dice higher than that unit's leadership, which is actually hard to do on Space Marines. And then you get to control that one dude, which is great, and it's cool, and it was really cool and thematic in this game. But it's not the same utility. I felt like I was a little limited there. I felt like a lot of the spells didn't do nearly as many mortal wounds as I was expecting them to. And it wasn't until after the game that I realized that with Smite, Smite and Arcane Bolt are just very different. Where obviously you can only shoot the closest enemy model with Smite, which you don't have that limitation in AOS with Arcane Bolt. However, there is something also unique in that if you roll a 10 or higher on Smite, it does d6 mortal wounds. Now, I didn't catch that during the game because I kept thinking, how are these guys good at shooting magic anything? Because nothing can do d6 mortal wounds. I don't have a last cannon equivalent type thing. But that's because I didn't realize that. And the Lore of Change has a +2 modifier if he's at full health. So he realistically needs an 8. There's artifacts and command traits that can bring that down to a 6 to get that d6 mortal wound. So that's fair, I think. In terms of, fitting the theme of this army is all about magic, I think it makes sense. So that's something I had to walk away with and be like, they don't seem very magical. And then I realized, well, everyone can do Smite, and your one dude can do a super Smite if he wants to, plus all the other spells that chip away. Yeah, okay, I'm down with that. And so, yeah, last note on Tzeentch Demons specifically is that this army is weirdly, strong. But I mean, tough. The fact that everything has an invuln save. So Ben brought these, crazy guns. Heavy bolters and plasma and... what's not magma? I don't know. I think Melta. There we go, Melta guns. But none of that mattered because the modifiers didn't affect the invuln save. And so the first turn, I was just on fire with my 4-ups. It was just weird. But he dumped all 3 Centurions into a unit of Flamers, and it barely wiped them out. And so, you know what I mean? They were a strangely strong thing. Now I know there was an edit in the new codex, coming from the index to the codex, where it used to be that blue and brimstone horrors both had a 4-up as well, and they changed it to where blues get a 5-up, brimstones get a 6-up, and that seems totally fair to me. But even just flooding the board with pinks, I have 40 pink horror models. That's a lot to chew through when it comes to that many shots. It's a lot of potential wasted if my opponent's firing big guns at them, and so that was just very interesting to see. The models on the table I felt like stuck around longer in 40k than they did in AOS, which I appreciate because I put a lot of time into painting them, and so it was good to see that. So as far as takeaways and what I'm going to do going forward, takeaways where I need to learn my spell lore a lot more. I need to actually take the cards out of the stratagem box, whatever, that little card, the deck you give you, and just really read them and plan out stuff. There was more than one turn where I accidentally did I casted one more spell than I should have for Lore of Change, because I thought it said he could cast 3, but he knows 3 can cast 2. So that's an important distinction. And so I just need to memorize the Psychic Phase a little bit more, because it's kind of the crux of my army. Beyond that, I need to think about ways to get the most out of the Demonic Incursion stratagem, which is what allowed me to put units in the warp and then have them come down later. This battle was not representative, I think, of what most fights would be, but it was interesting that I felt like I didn't have a good place to put them. I didn't plan that ahead of where I would drop this pink horror shooting bomb. So that was important to think about. And so, yeah, and just kind of pre-planning those things. When I walked in the store, that was the first time I opened the codex up to look at for competitive stuff. So I was like, I didn't look at the command traits really, or artifacts. I'm not too impressed with any of the Tzeentch artifacts. I've actually read it since then. I'm like, I don't I don't care for any of these. And but the command traits are pretty cool. You can do rerolling ones to shooting for his neat stuff. What I don't like is I feel like the Lord of Change should not be my general because he gets hit really easily because he can't be protected by people in front of him. But instead I'm going to build a Herald on a Chariot, and that is going to be far more survivable than most other things. So I think that's kind of the direction I'm going to go. Yeah, so I had a great time. Thank you, Ben, for being an awesome opponent and good teacher. I look forward to kind of bringing this again. When I play my next game, I hope to be far more comfortable with the phases and things like that. Like I said, I picked it up by turn 2. It'd be nice to start the game that way. And once I get more of a lock on my psychic phase, I think things will go really, really smoothly. So I'm looking forward to it. So anyway, if you have any suggestions on how to improve in terms of 40K games, how to build the best kinds of our list. I'm still struggling with the idea of all the detachments you can make. I looked at ways to do stuff with the model range that I have, and I found out that if I built a battalion plus whatever the one with elites is, I can actually add another command point, and it would be the exact same list. I didn't think about that when I was compiling it. And so, yeah, if you have any tips for those kinds of things, any tips for stratagems, if you're a demon player, I would love to hear those. Thank you all so much for watching, and happy wargaming. Hey friends, I hope you enjoyed that video, and I want to introduce you to some awesome folks. These are my patrons over on Patreon, and they make this show possible by their direct support of me to buy battle tomes and black library books and all the material I need and the hardware support that I need to make this stuff possible. And if you'd like to join them, go ahead and click over to the Patreon page, to the link in the description down below, and you'll be introduced to a really awesome community of people talking about the hobby, sharing what they're painting. I invite them to be part of polls to decide what content comes next. I raffle off every battle tome that I review, and we're having some great fun and discussions over there. So go ahead and check it out. Now, if you can't support in that way, that's completely fine. I'm just so glad that you watched this video here today. And if you have an Age of Sigmar lore question, go ahead and click subscribe and leave it in the comments down below. I read every single question and comment. I respond to as many as I possibly can, but I use them all as inspiration for future videos. So go ahead and do that now. And I look forward to seeing you guys on my next Age of Sigmar lore video. Thank you so much for watching, and happy wargaming.